had a small group of developers, and they were keen and eager, and they wanted to bring order to the house, and they were willing to do what it took. And so we just started going after it.
That is John Daniel, Salesforce architect for the B3 Group. I'm Josh Burke, developer evangelist for Salesforce, and here on the Salesforce Developer Podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. There, John is talking about one of the first ever Salesforce DX implementations, and today we're going to talk about his experiences using SFDX for technical architecture. And to start, well, we're going to start with the term that's something of a favorite amongst the community, happy soup.
So happy soup is this term that has surfaced in the community to represent or mean the Salesforce org and all of its metadata, but it's just this big pot of blended, whatever you want to call it, spaghetti code into it. There's no beginning to end. It's just one. It's just a big cauldron, and it's a big soup, and it's a mess, and it's all together, and it represents everything. It symbolizes things like the interdependencies and circular references that are so often found in Salesforce development. Things like, when you get like a visual force page that has an Apex controller that talks to another Apex class. It runs a query against an object, and that query against that object has an action item override to another Lightning page or visual force page or whatever. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, that first visual force page now has a dependency on a totally different object. And it's not really intended to do it, but it blends it all together. And so it's a term, I think Salesforce marketing does not like that term. I think they've tried to squash that term actually quite a bit, but I don't think they were successful.
Yeah.
But it represents a disorganized org or an org that just, it's very difficult to understand where things begin and end.
I mean, it kind of sounds like the architectural equivalent of spaghetti code.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. I'm not sure what kind of a soup is spaghetti and soup, but
right.
It's dinner.
It feels like there's something there. And is this just really kind of an aspect of overall technical debt, or is there kind of a deeper cause to creating this soup?
I think it's a mixed bag of reasons. I think in my experience, I've seen orgs that, it's been interesting because Salesforce and the Salesforce phenomenon reminds me a lot of. Again, I got started in the world in development in the mid-'90s, and so Microsoft Office and specifically Microsoft Access was a big thing back then.
Right.
And Microsoft Access was great in the 90s because it was very simple, and it was WYSIWYG and drag and drop, and a business type person could easily come in and set up an app, and off to the races you were going.
Yeah.
But Access had this terrible reputation. It wouldn't scale. It was always having issues. You couldn't have concurrent record access. And it turns out it wasn't a problem with the Access program. It was a problem with the way the application was designed. Because I came across one guy in particular who was truly the embodiment of a Microsoft technical architect. And this guy could run entire enterprises on a single Access database and be performant as all get up because he knew how to properly craft an application. Mm-hmm. And so when I came into Salesforce, I saw the same type of behavior. I mean, you've got a lot of people out here who have made arguably awesome careers, but they've only ever known the world of Salesforce, and they probably came up the ranks through, starting out as, admins or whatnot, and they did somebody asked them to go and write a trigger to do, whatever hello world function or something like that. And, they've been organically learning how to pull it together. But, have they been in a position where, some of the old school development shops where they focus on things like the Gang of Four design patterns and Martin Fowler's patterns of enterprise development in architecture. And they just haven't had the exposure to some of these concepts. And so they don't know any better. And then, I guess the other thing I see a lot of times is these orgs that have lots of life, and you actually get multiple architects in there, and they have multiple architectural visions. And so that's a different type of dynamic. I mean, you've got guys who come in with very good, real ideas, but they don't have, complete control over the org. So it's difficult. I mean, one of the benefit I had over at the law firm was the buck stopped with me. But I mean, I didn't have godlike power, but we had a clear single vision about how we wanted to pull that together. And
Right.
we were unified and we could make some things happen.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk some specifics when it comes to adoption. You've talked about in the past about vertically slicing and horizontally slicing. What does vertically slicing mean?
So vertically slicing is part of, I guess, a mental exercise about how do you, when you're trying to take your org, take your happy soup, and you're trying to put it into multiple packages. The first thing the first thing you definitely don't want to do is just take your entire org and put it into a single unlock package.
Right, because at that point you've pretty much codified the happy soup.
Well, exactly. And exactly. And it's just sort of like, okay, what was the point actually? And so, how do you take your code base and start splitting it up and organizing it? What patches do you really look at? And so vertically slicing was the term that I gave. Basically things like, take a look at your org and see what applications are there. So if you're in the old classic mode, it's the drop list in the upper right-hand corner, all the different applications there. Or if it's in lightning mode, it's the tic-tac-toe box on the left. What are the applications? And start thinking about your org as, just verticals of each of those different types of applications. And then, the first exercise out of the gate is always to identify all of the metadata that you have in the org and then pin it to these different verticals. Understand, start figuring out, what is supposed to be going in that, and then identify, things that really belong to every vertical. And so you'll deal with that as the next phase.
Gotcha. So then what is that next phase? Is that the horizontal slicing?
That's usually the horizontal slicing. The horizontal slicing is more about layering your application and layering it by purpose.
Okay.
Because, one of the hallmarks of a good code base is a really good naming convention.
Okay.
You should be able to look at the name of a class or a flow and understand exactly what its purpose is doing.
Yeah.
And really, you should make sure that it doesn't have multiple purposes. So that when you get into the design concept of separation of concern, it's all about, each thing has a specific purpose, and it's about organizing your code so that you manage that. All too often I'll see a developer come out there with like a Lightning component and an Apex controller to back it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's doing business logic in the controller. He's doing querying. He's doing, DML updates, transaction control. And again, it's just sort of like, get into the work, think about it more as, the controller's purpose is really to just massage data into a way that either the VF page or the Lightning component can consume it. It's not about, processing the logic. It's not about doing DML. It's not about even querying that kind of logic. And so, again, if you're properly layering your code, then you have, you have far less waste. You have far less duplication. So if you have a process that manages the updation, you might update a critical account with a specific discount or something like that, or maybe an opportunity or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you probably don't want to put that into like the visual force controller that manages the opportunity, and the controller that's backing up the Lightning UI, and then the invocable method class that is, you're running from the flow, and then you've got the REST API. You don't want to do this discounting every single time. Each one of those guys are basically client tier type aspects, and they should all be calling some level of a service tier to manage the actual applying of the discount in the proper way. Therefore, you can keep that logic in a single way.
Yeah.
So horizontally slicing is about, understanding where your layers are. What are the client layers? What are the service layers? If you follow the enterprise patterns that Andy Fawcett was promoting in his book, it's all about, the domain logic versus service level logic, and just organizing it that way.
Yeah. It's interesting, the naming convention, because I feel like there's an additional challenge to that when it comes to Salesforce development, because if you go back to like Java development, there's a certain level of structure that's enforced on your code because you're putting things into packages, you're putting things into folders. And so you kind of have like, if they're all in the same family, then they're all in the same folder, and you don't have to worry that much about the naming convention, right? So what are some of the styles and suggestions you have for like naming Apex classes and visual force pages and Lightning Web Components to help keep that straight?
So yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, because like I said, in Java, there was, we had the added benefit of being able to move the code into subdirectories under, in the classic metadata project, it's the SRC folder and the classes folder. And
Right.
and then out in that folder, you have 3,000 Apex classes,
Exactly.
and it's difficult to understand and organize that. But, one of the things that we adopted, was what we called for a while, we called it a sub namespace, and we call it a class prefix. Basically, it's very easy to look at a code base and identify the code that is owned by whatever third-party managed package is out there, because the third-party managed package has a namespace on every bit of metadata that's out there. So it's easy to sort it by the namespace.
Yeah.
And we were looking for some sort of mechanism to do the same thing, because again, that first year at the law firm, we didn't have DX. We didn't have DX source format, which allows us to move things into subdirectories as well.
Yeah.
But so what we came up with is with this concept of a prefix, and that we would just append to every class and really every S object and every flow and everything. And it was, again, identifying what our packages and our modules of the org look like, or the applications. And so, even though we didn't have DX and packaging out of the gate, we knew it was coming. So we started organizing things, and we sort of logically figured out what kind of a package model or package hierarchy that we wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so what that did was allow us to organize things like there was common library utilities, there was common service layer type things that we wanted to, and then there was, like at the law firm, there was one process that was all about intake. That was the processing, and it was everything from the point where we get the phone call saying, hey, I want to sue my brother-in-law or whatever, and all the way to the point where we say, yes, we do want to take you on as a client. And so there's all that processing there, and that was the intake process. And so pretty much everything related to that code, or that section of the code, was all prefixed with the word intake.
Gotcha.
And then when it became a lawsuit, or it was also called a matter, we would prefix that logic there. And so it was very simple to organize and say, yeah, this piece of logic goes to this general idea and package.
Yeah.
And it was important because we knew when we were going to start separating things out into various packages, we wanted to isolate, say, the library code first, because we knew we were going to codify the library package, the very first thing.
Yeah.
And so it was easy to identify and pull that out and start mangling, and we didn't have all the extra noise of the rest of the org.
Right.
So.
Well, and then I guess going back to talking about like circular references, and that if the whole goal is to create boundaries that can then line up with second gen packaging, like how do you handle things that are dependent on each other and are creating these circular references?
It depends on the metadata type in question. So there are certain things that they're very easy to separate. So for example, you might have a custom S object.
Right.
And the custom S object, or standard S object like account, you might have a custom S object and call it foobar, and it might have a couple of different fields. Well, technically, the way Salesforce is set up, it'll allow you to deploy the fields as a separate deployment event from the main S object.
Right.
So what that afforded us to do, or ability to do, was we might have one S object one S object as part of a package, and we knew it was going to be deployed. And we knew that this package would always be deployed first. And so that would set up the S object. And we knew that other packages could add fields to the S object. We did it a lot with the account and the case objects as well. There's just, we didn't have a package that pre-installed the account because it was already in the org, but we would add new fields to that org depending on which package was installed. And so that kind of logic helps us to, when that second package is there, then we know we can rely on it, but we need to make sure that all our code that relies on it exists in the package that has the S object, or the field. And we needed to make sure that we did some testing actually where we deployed, say, the first package, which didn't have this extra field. And that ensured and validated that we didn't have logic that was depending on a field inadvertently that it shouldn't be.
Right. Gotcha.
And then you've got other things like, with what we found to be the silver bullet was the concept of dependency injection.
Okay.
And so what we did was we, again, piggybacking off of the proper layering that the Apex Common Enterprise Framework gave me, it had an example of dependency injection already there, and that was sort of the inspiration for it.
Mm-hmm.
The inspiration there was the Apex Common Framework has a hook that allows you to swap out maybe a selector class, which is responsible for querying,
Mm-hmm.
or swap out a service class or a domain class, and you can swap them out and replace them with a mock version of it. And so that's where the utilization of the Apex Mocks framework, which is there's a sister framework to it.
Huh.
And so the pattern was sort of there already, and it sort of inspired us to really think about how we're going to handle dependency injection.
Yeah.
And that sort of led it to, we realized that, the original version of the Apex Common Framework had a static mapping, if you will, or a service locator pattern, basically.
Yeah.
And that static mapping sort of worked in a non-DX world, but we had problems with it as soon as we started breaking out the packages, because the premise was that everything in the code base depended on the application factory for getting all of its instances of everything that you needed. But the application factory was statically mapped in the old world. And so that was our first problem that we had to solve. Okay. And so we needed to create a way to create the mappings, but in a flexible way, so that if I don't have a package installed there, well, the mapping doesn't exist. And so we needed the packages to carry their mappings with them. And so what we ended up with was custom metadata types and custom metadata type records. So just like I was saying that, with an S object, you can have an S object that comes out in one package and add more fields in another package. We did basically the same thing. We defined a core custom metadata type record, and we put that in the very foundation package, or the lib package that we have. And we adjusted our code logic so that instead of trying to rely on static mappings, what it would do is dynamically query this custom metadata record. Or this custom metadata type. And, and whatever records it finds there, it would filter them down based on the use case. And then invariably there would be a class name that was part of that record field. And so what we would do is then do the command to instantiate a class on the fly.
Yeah.
And we would instantiate that class on the fly and basically utilize it there. And so what the beautiful thing was, the custom metadata records didn't have to be there with the base package. But say we have another package that we install, it had the custom metadata records. It didn't have the custom metadata type defined, because that was already part of the...
So it was already done.
That was already done. It was already part of the org. And the unlock package said, well, you have a dependency on, say, the lib package, is what the paradigm that we had at the law firm. And so we were guaranteed that base custom metadata record would be there. And so when we install our package, all of a sudden, these records would show up, and the next iteration, all of a sudden, these records would be available, and you could spin up the logic accordingly. And so that dependency injection was what we started with. It was a crude form of it initially at the law firm. And when Dilip and I gave a talk at Trailhead DX 2018 about what the journey was, it piqued the interest of Andy Fawcett, and specifically the dependency injection part of it. And so he started talking to myself and another guy named Doug Ayers.
Yep.
And that led to, he was like, we really need to get this dependency injection concept out there and in a way that's consumable to everybody. And so that led to the creation of the Force DI, or the Force Dependency Injection framework.
Got it.
And so it was based off of, he had seen another framework out in the Java world. It was the Google Juice framework. And basically that does dependency injection in the world of Java. So he modeled it after this. And then Doug Ayers brought some absolutely just amazing adjustments to basically achieve dependency injection in flows.
Oh, okay. So that was actually going to be my next question, because we've talked a little bit about data. We've talked about functional things like Apex classes and the client side. So then how does this kind of play into it with the declarative side of development?
Yeah. So again, it was an amazing piece of work. It opened my eyes to the power of dependency injection. And I'm admittedly, I'm a coder at heart. I'm the guy who goes to the programmatic side all the time. if you give me a beer or give me something to drink, I'll get into a lovely philosophical argument about declarative versus programmatic. That aside, I was stunned when Doug Ayers finished with his work on the Force DI project, because it opened my eyes to what could really be done in the flow area.
Yeah.
And it was crazy there. And, basically it gives the ability to, again, insert and change and add things dynamically, which means that they're loosely coupled. And then that means that you can put some of the components in one package and other components in another package and add functionality just by the presence of which packages are actually installed at any given time.
Okay.
That was the way we set it up. And then basically, once that was done, we basically went back to the framework that we originally created at the law firm and adjusted it so it was using Force DI. And then that led to what is now called the AT4DX repo or framework. And so it depends on the Apex Mox and Apex Common, but also on the Force DI. And it's a very, very, very nice recipe, if you will, architectural recipe for setting up very involved dependency hierarchies in an org.
Got it. Okay, so we've mentioned it many times, and I really want to give like a real proper shout out to it. So so tell me about the Apex Enterprise Patterns, the open source group. Like what is it and what does it do?
So we had all these different frameworks, and Andy Fawcett used to work at Financial Force, and then he left there and went over to Salesforce, and then I was there at Financial Force, and Financial Force has been doing a lot of work with various technologies, but they set up the open source repo, but they had a little bit of staff turnover and a few other things, and so the repos, the Apex Mox and the Apex Common repos, it was a while to get some response as far as changes on those repos.
Gotcha.
And everybody's got to, put bread on the, put food on the table and earn a paycheck. So, asking people to do this in their off time.
Sure.
It's a little crazy. So last fall, so this was 2019, Andy Fawcett, myself, Stephen Wilcock from Financial Force, and a few others at Financial Force, as well as David Esposito from Patron Technology.
Gotcha.
We got together and we started talking about the idea of the two repos, Apex Mox and Apex Common, being sort of put under community control, if you will.
Got it.
And so that was the genesis of the Apex Enterprise Pattern Group. And then once that was set up, the Force DI project was added to it. And then later on, the AT4DX framework was added to it. So, and the purpose is basically, just a bunch of us developers who don't get to develop enough. Because, I'm a Salesforce architect now, so I don't get to develop all the time.
Right.
But, we get to do it and maintain these repos. And, we've been able to start to modernize them and take advantage of some of the newer things that are available. We've got plans for things like incorporating change data capture, and we've already got some platform events and platform cache built into the things.
Nice.
We've converted all the projects to Salesforce DX source format.
Nice.
And it's been a good move. Been definitely a good move.
Is there like if I go to the repo, what do I see? Is there like a roadmap or anything? Do you have like us to kind of like if I wanted to raise my hand and see where this is going? Is that all up on GitHub?
Not yet.
Okay.
Funny you should ask. I was talking to some of the guys about an hour ago, in fact, about that very thing.
Yeah.
No. So there's part of our focus right now is there's been a lot of articles written by lots of different architects and technical leads about how to use various facets of the frameworks, the Apex Mox, Apex Commons, Force DI. And so what we're doing right now is starting to get all of those organized. We're going to be contacting some of these authors and seeing if they're okay with us actually transferring those blog posts over to those repos. So they're all being a one-stop shop.
Got it.
We are going to set up a more holistic wiki again, the whole idea of what is the Apex Enterprise Patterns about, and this is where you start. So again, we got to put bread on food on the table first.
Right.
But the goal is by the year we'll get that in there, and then
Got it.
And there's some other things like we're going to take advantage. The next project I do there is to set up the CI, because we get a lot of pull requests coming through, and it's important to understand not only do the pull requests work for this particular project, but do the pull requests really work for all the downstream projects?
Right.
Because you've got, when you think about it, if there's a pull request to Apex Mox, which is technically the bottom of the stack, well, then there is, does it impact the Apex Common? Does it impact the Apex Common sample code repo?
Yeah.
Does it impact the AT40X? Does it impact the AT40X sample code repo? And so it'd be good. We've got our eye on GitHub Actions. I'm going to play with that shiny new thing and play with that a little bit and get that all set up.
That's our show. Now, before we go, I did ask John about his favorite non-technical hobby, and it turns out it's something that sounds delightful in the age of a pandemic.
Love going to the beach and driving on the beach. I go out to the Outer Banks, North Carolina, a lot, and there's several places you can just drive on the beach. But I love going to the beach. I'm just, I'll fly stunt kites and hang out on the beach and, just go all kinds of things. I'm quite content to just, sit on the beach and bring my laptop if I need to or something like that,
Well, beaches are still closed here in Chicago, so I guess that will have to do. Thanks for listening, and my thanks to John for the great conversation. If you want to learn more about this podcast, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite services. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.